So, we are very pleased to have with us today Dr. Nathan Goodman speaking on the topic climate change and militarized climate planning. So, Nathan is a senior research fellow and a senior fellow at the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in PPE at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. His research broadly focuses on political economy, public choice, market process economics, new institutional economics, and defense economics. He analyzes how alternative institutional arrangements shape the provision of security. He's especially interested in border militarization and the political economy of immigration policy. His talk is based on a recently published paper, which I will also put in the chat later, and this will also be shown in the YouTube description. So please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube in the next 1 week. So Nathan will be speaking for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A lasting, depending on the number of questions we get, probably 15 to 30 minutes maximum. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A function over the course of this presentation in the Q&A function below. I will hold on to these questions and then begin posing them to our speaker, Nathan, at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, I will now hand the time over to Nathan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate the invitation and I really appreciate you organizing this. So, I'm going to share my screen. So today I'll be speaking with all of you about a paper that, as Brian mentioned, was recently published in the Review of Austrian Economics called Militarized Climate Planning: What is Left? This is a paper that I co-authored with my colleagues Jordan Lofthouse and Michaela Novak, and all three of us are affiliated with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. So, in this paper, we're addressing problems of uh, climate change, right? So when people think about problems of climate change, they often think of both the fact that climate change results from human activity, from human activities that have negative externalities that result from emissions of greenhouse gases, and that these changes to the climate cause a variety of harmful and deleterious effects for human well-being. Everything from potentially increased intensity of fires to harms to agricultural crop yields, desertification, ocean acidification, potentially increased intensity of hurricanes, and so much more. So given the urgency that people perceive with these problems, some have decided that they think the way to mitigate climate change is to model our policy on prior instances of wartime mobilization. So the idea here is just like a war, climate change constitutes an immediate short-term crisis that cannot simply be addressed through the incremental adjustments of a market process or through the piecemeal democratic deliberations that occur in normal times. Because the climate crisis is a crisis, these analysts argue, we need to engage in mobilization efforts that are consciously constructed based upon the top-down mobilization that has occurred during prior war efforts. So one advocate of this approach is Lawrence Delina, who has a book that I'm showing on the screen here, Strategies for Rapid Climate Mitigation, Wartime Mobilization as a Model for Action. Now, Delina uses mobilization during World War II as his historical analog, as his model. And he uses this as a model for what he calls a rapid mitigation project. And so this involves a variety of concrete changes that are imposed from the top down in order to rapidly adjust our industrial capacity so as to reduce use of fossil fuels, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and thereby avert the warming of the Earth by more than, say, 2 degrees Celsius, right? And another approach that advocates a similar wartime planning perspective on this is that of Andreas Malm, who compares his preferred policies to Bolshevik war communism. Malm released his book with Verso Books in 2020. So he's not just responding to the perceived crisis of climate change, but also to the perceived crisis of COVID-19. He's arguing, look, we're in the midst of a response to a crisis, right? At the time, a variety of stay-at-home orders and restrictions on the opening and operation of businesses, restrictions on travel and immigration, all of these were in place. And Malm was arguing that a similar scale and scope of society-wide crisis response is necessary to address the climate crisis. Moreover, he argued that because both the climate crisis and the coronavirus pandemic were, in his view, results of the capitalist system, we should concretely model our approach to mitigating these ills upon efforts to dismantle the capitalist system. And in particular, he was inspired in this regard by Bolshevik war communism. So he was advocating what we might call comprehensive planning of the economy in a move towards eco-socialism. Now, Delina and Malm are not alone. In our paper, we assemble a table of a variety of scholars who advocate various types of economic planning and top-down policy response that are directly inspired by past war mobilizations. So it's not just Delina, it's not just Andreas Malm, it's also Nobel laureate in economics Joseph Stiglitz, um, and a variety of other authors, right? So that's what we're critiquing in this paper, is this idea that the severity and urgency of the climate crisis calls for top-down policy approaches that are explicitly modeled upon past instances of wartime economic planning. So, what's our problem with this approach? Well, we're inspired by the work of the economist Don Lavoie. And Lavoie published two very important and influential books in the year 1985. And we're really focused on the second of these two books, National Economic Planning, What is Left? And so in this book, Lavoie lays out a taxonomy of two problems associated with attempts at centralized economic planning. He calls these the knowledge problem and the power problem. Now, you can see that he's quite directly building on the work of economists such as Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises here. In his other book, Rivalry and Central Planning, he goes through their contributions and offers a rigorous and robust intellectual history of the socialist calculation debate. In this book, National Economic Planning, What is Left, Lavoie is offering a more applied treatment of the issues, a set of arguments that show how the knowledge problem and problems of discretionary power are strong institutional consequences of attempts at centralized economic planning, and furthermore, how this results in a hampering of our ability to coordinate with one another, to make use of local and tacit knowledge, and to sustain a free society. Now, we take his taxonomy of knowledge problems and power problems, and we break out the notion of power problems into incentive problems, for which we draw heavily on the work of public choice economists, and what we're calling militarism problems. And so these are some of the distinctive problems associated with the type of coercive social control associated with militarism and war. Um, Moreover, we build on Lavoie's work in that we recognize a taxonomy he draws between comprehensive planning and non-comprehensive planning. So when you think about the original paper that kick-started the socialist calculation debate, Economic Planning in the Socialist Commonwealth by Ludwig von Mises, that paper was directly responding to attempts at comprehensive economic planning. That is, efforts to entirely abolish private property in the means of production and replace coordination via prices and profit and loss with coordination of the entire economy under the administration of central economic planners. Non-comprehensive planning, on the other hand, refers to attempts to plan some sector of the economy. So industrial policy would be an example of non-comprehensive planning. Chris Coyne and Abby Hall argue that militaries tend to themselves be instances of non-comprehensive planning, right? Lots of government policies, even in nominally market-based economies, constitute instances of non-comprehensive planning. And while the costs of this are lower than the costs of introducing calculational chaos into the whole economy by destroying the price mechanism and attempting to replace it with comprehensive planning, there are still pervasive knowledge problems and power problems, Lavoie argues, even in efforts at non-comprehensive planning. So we can think about the different approaches to a war footing approach to climate change as existing on a spectrum, with some of them advocating more non-comprehensive modes of planning and others advocating more comprehensive modes of planning. So, for instance, Andreas Malm is directly modeling his proposals on a period in Soviet history that is characterized by something quite close to comprehensive planning. Whereas some of the other advocates of a war footing are advocating some more mild form of non-comprehensive planning. But these are differences of degree. All of these attempts at top-down command and control planning of large swaths of economic activity are going to be subject to both knowledge problems and power problems. Let's discuss each of these in turn. So, the knowledge problem grows out of the work not just of Don Lavoie, but also, as I said, Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. So how do we think about the knowledge problem? Well, first, consider the fact that we face a bewildering throng of possible production plans. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that there are a lot of different goods and services that could be produced, and each good or service that could be produced could typically be produced with multiple mixes of inputs, right? So, for instance, take this cup that I might use to drink a glass of water. It happens to be made of plastic, but it could just as easily be made out of metal or out of wood or perhaps out of bamboo, right? So, how did the producers choose out of all the possible ways to make a cup what raw materials they were going to use to make that cup? Moreover, how did they choose that they were going to produce a cup rather than some alternative good, right? There's a lot of different goods that could satiate various human wants. And if we overproduce large quantities of a particular good to a point that we produce more than anyone wants, well, there's an opportunity cost there, isn't it? We are foregoing a variety of other valuable goods and services whenever we use scarce resources to produce any given good. We need to therefore ask, what should we make and what should we use to make it? This problem is challenging, the Austrian economists tell us, because the underlying inputs that go into a production process are both heterogeneous and multi-specific. Well, what do those terms mean? Well, heterogeneous is the opposite of homogeneous. It means that different goods are different and are not perfectly substitutable with one another. So, for instance, you cannot easily use crude oil to substitute for cocoa beans in a chocolate bar, right? Those are two different goods, and a chocolate bar that you try to make using crude oil rather than cocoa beans will turn out disgusting. Might even turn out inedible or deadly, right? But it is also the case that uh, both crude oil and cocoa beans have multiple specific uses that they can be put towards, right? The crude oil could be used to refine it into gasoline that you would use to drive your car or your truck. It could be used for jet fuel that you could use to fly an aircraft. It could be used to manufacture plastic products. It could be used to heat a house or a greenhouse, right? And each of these uses of crude oil has an opportunity cost because you're foregoing alternative uses of crude oil. Likewise, cocoa beans can be used to produce chocolate bars, but they also could be used to produce cocoa butter, a skincare product, right? And so this multiplicity of uses of cocoa beans once again means that you need to make choices about how you're going to allocate this scarce resource in order to produce things that consumers value. So how do we know which production plans will best satisfy people? The answer, according to the Austrian economists, such as Mises, Hayek, and Lavoie, is that no individual knows. However, under an institutional arrangement characterized by exchangeable private property rights and relatively free markets, exchange ratios known as prices will emerge, and these prices will reflect the relative scarcities of goods and services and underlying inputs, and they will wind up reflecting consumer preferences and guiding people to coordinate their plans with one another in a manner that allows for producing goods and services that people find satisfying, avoiding problems such as shortages and gluts, and discovering ways to coordinate our plans with one another. By contrast, if any single mind or committee attempts to, from the top down, decide how we are going to make these production decisions, they are not going to have access to price feedback. They're not going to have access to profit and loss feedback. And as a result, they can only act on the knowledge that they, as decision makers, have access to. Much of the knowledge that other people have of their particular circumstances of time and place will remain tacit and will, in fact, go utterly undiscovered. We therefore are likely to see chaotic and wasteful decisions made. So, as I said, in market economies, we address the knowledge problem using the three Ps. So property is the institutional foundation for the market process solution to knowledge problems. So property rights mean that you have a right to the goods you own, and you can sell them to a willing buyer, and you don't have to part with them if you don't receive an offer that is to your liking, right? Prices emerge as a result of the exchanges that arise under conditions of private property. Prices are exchange ratios. From those prices, we can then get profit and loss feedback, right? Profit or your loss is the revenue that you earn minus the costs of all that you expended in order to produce a good or service, right? And so all of this is going to reflect prices of your underlying inputs as well as the price of the final good that you sell. If you make a profit, that means that consumers are willing to pay more for what you produced than you had to pay in order to secure all the inputs necessary to produce it. That means, from a social perspective, that you created value. By contrast, if you make losses, that suggests you're destroying value. And so, property prices and profit and loss enable people to coordinate their plans with one another. Another way to think about this, as Hayek tells us in The Use of Knowledge in Society, is that the price system is a mechanism for communicating information. That's its real function. The most significant fact, Hayek says, about this system is the economy of knowledge with which it operates. That is, each individual participant doesn't need to know all that much in order to be able to take actions that will coordinate well with the interests of other people. Now, why does this matter for climate policy? There are a couple of objections that somebody might raise here. One might be that just as in a war, in a case of climate policy, you're not trying to please the most people or create the highest valued use of scarce resources. Instead, you have a narrow technical goal that you, a planner, can, through the use of scientific knowledge, plan for, right? So just as in a war like World War II, you might have a singular goal. We want to defeat Nazi Germany. And in order to do that, we're willing to make choices that will be costly, that will mean that some people don't get goods and services they value. All right, fair enough. Similarly, maybe we want to avert warming in excess of 2 degrees Celsius by a particular date, right? And in order to do that, we are willing to expend scarce resources in a way that means that there are some shortages of certain goods or that we're not going to get as much of what people value, right? Okay, fair enough. But here's one problem. What's the actual problem with climate change? Why do we object to it? Well, a big part of the type of problem that groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, point to is that climate change is likely to, in expectation, make many people poorer, right? It will impoverish people and make their lives worse. Why will it impoverish people and make their lives worse? Well, partially because it will disrupt their production plans. Say you've been growing a particular crop in a particular place, and it ceases to be sustainable to grow that kind of crop there as climate changes. Well, in that case, you can be expected to bear losses, right? And if people are not able to freely adjust their inputs, whether they're labor or their capital, to move to an area where they can be comparably productive in agricultural labor and production, we might expect to see potentially a shortfall in food supplies, right? Well, this sounds like a problem related to the coordination of production plans, doesn't it? Right? This is a problem that is not just a technical problem. How do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a sufficient level that we reduce the expected increase in global temperatures? No, this involves a multiplicity of problems. Problems of agricultural output, problems of natural disasters and natural disaster recovery, a whole multiplicity of ecological, human, and economic problems. And these human and economic problems are ones that require us to be able to solve coordination problems and knowledge problems related to coordinating our plans with one another and discovering ways under rapidly changing conditions to adjust our production plans and adjust our usage of scarce resources in order to create more with less and create value for one another under difficult conditions, right? Throughout the socialist calculation debate, sometimes the market socialists, drawing on neoclassical economics, would point to equilibrium solutions and say, why can't you just solve the system of simultaneous equations? Why can't you just, through trial and error, get us to a point where we approximate an equilibrium, right? This was the sort of point that Lange and Lerner made in their debates with Mises and Hayek. Well, that might be feasible in a truly static economy, where it's just a matter of taking a given set of preferences and a given set of constraints and figuring out, calculating what the equilibrium solution is. But that's not going to be feasible in an environment where we need to learn under conditions of changing preferences, changing constraints, and changing information. And so, in a world of climate change, a world characterized by certain types of unanticipated and unpredictable changes that endanger human lives and cause harm and frustration to people's production plans, we actually need the learning process, the social learning process enabled by the price mechanism now more than ever. And so the types of knowledge problems that the Austrian economists point to are incredibly relevant for adjusting to climate change and creating a set of conditions where our mitigation efforts enable us to move towards a better state of affairs than that expected under conditions of runaway climate change. And so, in order to discover a set of solutions to these problems that improves rather than reducing human well being, we need the types of social learning processes that are enabled not through top down planning, but through adjustment of prices within an entrepreneurial market process. There are also incentive problems associated with administering top-down systems of social control. Agents within the political process, as public choice theorists teach us, face a variety of incentive problems. One pertains to rent seeking. A variety of interest groups and companies have incentives to expend scarce resources to lobby governments to do things that will give them a variety of special privileges and private interests. Closely related is the problem of regulatory capture. There are also problems of principal agent problems. These essentially result from information asymmetries between decision makers within a government, those who are above them within a governmental hierarchy, and the voters that those government officials are supposed to serve. Because there are information asymmetries between voters and politicians between politicians and bureaucrats throughout a chain of command, we have room for substantial opportunism, expanding the power of individuals within top-down bureaucracies. Expanding their discretionary power in the way that militarization entails is likely to exacerbate these principal agent problems. There's also problems of rational ignorance on the part of voters, which are going to exacerbate the aforementioned principal agent problems. There are problems of moral hazard, where people might be encouraged to take on additional risks, including environmental risks, because they lack accountability for their actions. And there might be reasons to focus on the short term. So if climate change is largely a long-term problem, but the decision makers that we're empowering via militarized power are simply thinking about how they get reelected at the next election, we might actually exacerbate the problem because it might be in the interest of politicians to subsidize things that produce short-term gains at the expense of the global climate. All of this means that even if a good decision is known, decision makers empowered by the war mobilization model might lack incentives to implement such a solution. Another issue is the issue of political externalities. So perhaps the main way that economists think about global climate change is as a problem of negative externalities, right? I make a deal with a company to produce a good that I value. All right, I pay the company, they're willing to give me the good. A voluntary exchange has taken place. It appears to be a situation that's a win-win, a case of mutual benefit. However, the factory that produced the good I purchased, it emitted greenhouse gases, those greenhouse gases then cause harm for individuals throughout the globe. There's been a negative externality that was not taken into account by myself or the factory owner when we entered into a voluntary exchange. Aha, the Pigouvian says, a market failure. This market failure requires a governmental solution in order to restore efficiency. All right, fair enough. But here's the problem. Similar externalities occur within political contexts. Randall Holcomb, in his book Political Capitalism, emphasizes that political exchanges typically occur within a low transaction cost group. Individuals such as politicians, high-ranking bureaucrats, and politically connected businessmen, as well as lobbyists, are in a group that knows one another and is able to make exchanges with one another, while ordinary people face prohibitively high transaction costs associated with engaging in political exchange. Now, this is likely to pose a problem when it comes to implementing top-down climate policies, which might benefit those within the political economic elite, but impose negative externalities upon others, say by raising their cost of living. Um, Political externalities can also be a driver of climate change. So, for instance, decision makers in the American Congress, as well as the Pentagon, may then make deals with defense contractors in the military industrial complex to purchase aircraft, weapons, and so on for the benefit of US military decision makers. This might generate large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions that are effectively government subsidized. And in fact, this does occur. So this could be a situation where you have deals made among members of a political economic elite that face low transaction costs, and in the process you generate negative externalities that exacerbate climate change. So there's no guarantee that moving towards a system of greater hierarchical control and discretionary power will generate incentives to solve climate change, and certainly no guarantee that it will generate incentives to do so in a least cost manner that benefits those within the broader society. Finally, to round out our discussion of the problems with militarized climate planning, we want to discuss a category we call militarism problems. And our analysis of militarism problems builds on Lavoie's analysis of what he calls the power problem. That is, the discretionary power that efforts at central economic planning entail consolidating in the hands of high-ranking decision makers. That discretionary power allows them space to act badly, to abuse other people. It might generate institutional filtering processes that select for those who like wielding discretionary power over others. And as such, it might result in a situation where, as Hayek tells us in The Road to Serfdom, the worst get on top. Similar dynamics can be seen especially in the operation of militarism. As my colleagues Chris Coyne and Abigail Hall document both in papers such as Empire's State of Mind, The Illiberal Foundations of Liberal Hegemony, and in books such as their recent satirical work, How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite, successfully implementing militaristic policies requires an illiberal willingness to engage in coercion, violence, and social control, along with various civil liberties abuses and violations of international law over subordinate populations at home and abroad. That's going to select for people who adopt an illiberal mindset, a mindset that sees other people as pawns to be used rather than as fellow citizens to engage with respectfully and on equal footing. We might worry that similar selection processes would operate for those who sit atop a hierarchy aimed at reconstructing our production processes and our economic interactions in order to mobilize against climate change. It might select for relatively authoritarian personality types. Moreover, as the economic historian Robert Higgs writes in his classic book, Crisis and Leviathan, crises, including wars, enable expansions in both the scale and the scope of government power. The scale refers to something like the amount of resources used, the fiscal scale of government programs. The scope refers to the range of activities that government agents may engage in. So, for instance, if you have an expansion in surveillance powers that the police have access to, That's an expansion in the scope of government, but not necessarily an expansion in the scale of government. Meanwhile, if you hire additional government bureaucrats, but they don't have an expanded range of power, that's an expansion in the scale of government, but not an expansion in the scope of government. Each of these can occur during crises, and efforts to frame climate change as a crisis, and in particular a crisis tantamount to war, draw our attention towards a way of organizing our responses that involves expanding the discretionary power of those who would exercise power over others. Moreover, environmental activists should be concerned that expanding the militarized powers of states, the coercive social control capabilities of states, will not necessarily lead to outcomes that they would like. After all, states are not just mechanisms for promoting environmental sustainability. States are organizations by which individuals with power and individuals who can lobby those with power exert violent social control over those that they see as opponents within contexts of social and economic conflict. In practice, this has meant that militarized police powers have been wielded against environmental activists around the world. Some environmentalists, therefore, such as Alexander Dunlop, Andrea Brock, and the various authors that they brought together in their edited volume Enforcing Ecocide, argue that state power and militarism are used to enforce unjust restrictions on the actions of environmental activists. Expanding militarized power, therefore, might not empower environmental activists to achieve their goals, but might instead empower their political opponents to coercively restrain the autonomy of those seeking a greener planet. So the types of approaches that we've talked about as instances of militarized climate planning are, to use a term developed by Michael Polanyi and expanded upon by Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom, these are monocentric approaches. What's a monocentric system? Well, a monocentric system is characterized by a single independent center of decision making to which all other centers of decision making are subordinate, right? A single center of decision making that gets to issue commands to others throughout the system. And a militarized approach pretty naturally lends itself towards monocentric decision making. Think about the organization of the United States military. The President of the United States is what? He is the Commander in Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. Let's repeat that. The Commander in Chief of the United States Armed Forces. What's the first word there? The meaning single. There is a single commander in chief to whom everyone in the chain of command ostensibly answers. That is a pretty good definition of a monocentric system right there, folks. And some scholars would like to organize responses to climate change around that single man in charge model, around war mobilizations led by those atop a singular hierarchy. By contrast, a polycentric approach is characterized by many, multiple, formally independent centers of decision making. That's right, multiple formally independent centers of decision making. So, what are examples of polycentric systems? Well, the market process is one example, right? Each firm within a market is an independent center of decision making. Individuals are free to form new firms, to enter the market. So, the processes of adjustment, discovery, and spontaneous order that emerge within market contexts, that's one example of a polycentric order. What are other examples? Well, science is a classic example of a polycentric order. That's what Michael Polanyi wrote about in some of his early work on polycentricity. A scientific community is characterized not by some science czar who commands other scientists from the top down, who says, all right, Nathan Goodman, it's your job to study militarized climate planning, and nobody else can do it unless they get a license from me. No, that would be a terrible way to do science. It would mean that my research findings couldn't be contested and critiqued by people from other research groups. The actual polycentric way in which we do science, in which a variety of research teams at a variety of research centers, universities, private firms, and more coordinate with one another, cooperate with one another, submit to a multiplicity of journals and conferences, operate within multiple disciplinary fields, and contest one another's findings, that process of contestation and social learning can only occur within polycentric systems, as opposed to within top-down systems of monocentric social control. And so we argue that contrary to the monocentric approach associated with militarized climate planning, it is better to embrace a polycentric approach to addressing climate change. But people might say, there's a problem. I don't think a polycentric approach can work. And here's one reason that they might say that. First, they might say climate change is a global public bad. Now, a public bad here means essentially the opposite of a public good, something that people would be willing to pay to avoid. However, the harms are both non-rivalrous and non-excludable. It's a situation in which everybody's affected. It's a joint harm. And so another way to think about it is that mitigation of climate change, the reduction in climate change, is a global public good. If we reduce climate change by one firm or one country reducing their CO2 emissions, and another firm or country does not reduce their CO2 emissions, you can't easily say, well, I'm going to keep the nice climate for me and my firm or my country that actually engaged in mitigation efforts, because you, free rider, you don't deserve to benefit from the cooler climate. You can't do that. The climate is not something you can exclude people from so long as you're sharing an Earth, right? And as a result, that means that there might be incentives to free ride. And so that concern that individuals or nations will free ride means that many people think any solution must therefore be both global, so that you don't have nation states with an incentive to instead prioritize things like economic development and production and prosperity, and therefore, uh, engage in production processes that benefit them economically but cause global greenhouse gas emissions, right? You're worried that those nations will free ride. So you want a global solution, and you want it to be enforced from the top down so that you can exercise sanctions against free riders. All right. Well, any such solution implicates the knowledge, incentive, and power problems that I discussed earlier in the talk. So this seems to be a bit of a problem, a bit of a dilemma. So the reason people might question whether a polycentric approach can work is that, as I said, it's a global public good, and that means that there is a free rider problem. But I want to emphasize that in addition to global externalities, decisions related to climate change also involve smaller scale externalities. In addition to global externalities, decisions related to climate change involve smaller scale externalities. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example. Um, the pollution that occurs in a local area doesn't just contribute to a warming climate. It also is likely to have more direct neighborhood effects on air quality. It's going to make it less pleasant to take your kids out to play in the park. It's going to potentially cause localized respiratory health problems for people in the neighborhood or city where the air pollution is taking place. And this might mean that people at a smaller level of decision making, such as a national government or a local government or a neighborhood association or a private firm or a civic association, will have incentives to engage in efforts to reduce that pollution because they reap smaller scale benefits, these private benefits or these local public goods associated with improving health by improving air quality in their local area. And so that, what some analysts call co-benefit, creates incentives for participation on the local level. And from those incentives, we may be able to build up incentives for a functional polycentric system of climate change mitigation, despite the problems of global externalities. So, as I said, reducing air pollution in a town or neighborhood doesn't just help with climate change, it also makes it easier to breathe, reduces risks of lung cancer, and even protects mental and cognitive health. Another example of situations where you might have local governance that can help with a global problem is the issue of forests, right? So many schemes at cap and trade or at buying carbon credits involve paying people to preserve forests. Why is that? Well, trees take in CO2 and convert it into oxygen. They act, in other words, as carbon capture technologies. Forests are often small and medium scale common pool resources rather than being large scale global commons. And in some cases, they're even private goods managed by timber companies. But in many cases, they are small and medium scale common pool resources managed by communities of resource users. And as Eleanor Ostrom and her colleagues found in their research on such common pool resources, these can be effectively managed and governed by community members. However, community members' rights aren't always respected. And this type of top-down external interference in local self-governance arrangements can often make it harder to sustainably manage and govern these common pool resources and to preserve forests. Respecting local autonomy such that people can discover and implement effective local self-governance, effective grassroots self-governance of these local common pool resources might therefore be one effective polycentric bottom-up way to improve climate-related outcomes. Another way to think about this, which Eleanor Ostrom wrote about, is that these are systems of nested externalities, which make polycentric action sustainable. In other words, many actions related to greenhouse gas emissions have multiple externalities involved, not just the externality associated with global climate change. And so this has often been underrated in the literature. And once we appreciate this, we can recognize that individuals, families, communities, and states often gain a benefit in addition to the global benefits when they take action to address issues of climate change. Finally, I want to briefly discuss a notion that my co-authors and I have been thinking about as an alternative to the climate war footing, an approach instead grounded in a concept we're calling climate peace. So there are several ways that people think about the relationship between climate change and conflict or war. One is the notion that climate change is going to be a cause of war, that the stress, the resource scarcity, the changing conditions associated with climate change are likely to provoke armed conflict. Another way, the way that the people we're responding to in this paper sometimes think about it, is that war can be a solution to climate change, or at least that warlike attempts at top-down mobilization can be the solution to climate change. And another way is that war can be a cause of climate change, that war can contribute to climate change by, for instance, engaging in wartime mobilization that involves doing things like flying fighter jets in a manner that burns large amounts of fossil fuels. And so, for instance, the Pentagon, according to Netta Crawford of the Cost of War Project, burns large amounts of greenhouse gases. Now, one thing that these different ways of thinking about this can draw our attention to is that we can think about peace and peace building as a means to cope with climate change, both to avoid the warfare that itself contributes to climate change, but also to help people discover solutions to the interpersonal and intergroup conflicts that a changing climate might otherwise provoke. So we might think about ways in which individuals and groups might come into conflict and how they can, from the bottom up, discover ways to peaceably resolve their conflicts rather than resolving them through violent warfare, and how this can help us thrive and survive in a warming world, and potentially discover ways to mitigate climate change. So, what sorts of theories might we build on in developing a theory of climate peace? Well, one thing we might build on is the work of the economist Kenneth Boulding, who was a major contributor to the field of peace and conflict studies. His book, Stable Peace, discusses some of the underlying conditions, the situations of both strength and strain, the variables that affect the likelihood that a set of people who have conflicting interests, or a set of nations that have apparent conflicting interests, might go to war or might find themselves in a situation where war is unthinkable, where the idea of going to war with one another seems entirely outside the Overton window. And so this can help us think about how we might build up the types of mutually supportive relationships and understandings of one another that could enable us to have robust relationships in which we'll cooperate in a warming world rather than fighting each other over the limited resources that we have in a warming world. Likewise, we can think about the work that Elise Boulding, who was married to Kenneth Boulding, both of them were Quakers, both of them were founding figures in the field of peace studies. Kenneth Boulding was an economist, Elise Boulding was a sociologist, and her book, Cultures of Peace, The Hidden Side of History, looks at the bottom-up ways that individuals and communities at various scales find themselves in situations of genuine conflict, situations where people have interests that conflict with one another, but through the use of things like social norms, as well as creative interaction with one another, they discover ways to sustain peaceable ways of dealing with these conflicts. We can build on the work of Eleanor Ostrom. Her works, such as Governing the Commons, provide us with a framework for thinking about how people resolve collective action problems, including in situations where they have to manage scarce resources and where there might be conflicts among resource users, and how they can endogenously develop these institutions and craft these institutions from the bottom up. We can think about the work of my colleague Paul Dragos-Alagica, who was a student of the Ostroms and whose work in books like Public Entrepreneurship, Citizenship, and Self-Governance looks at the way in which ordinary citizens can play a role in resolving collective action challenges and helping solve the various social dilemmas that we might face. Likewise, we can think about the classic works of Alexis de Tocqueville, whose Democracy in America focuses on the art and science of association, the way people in local communities devise ways to produce various valued goods and services, to engage in associational life with one another, and to thereby create a thriving civil society. Similar work in the 20th century was carried on by Richard Cornwell, whose books such as Reclaiming the American Dream really helped us understand the role of civil society in the independent sector. As natural disasters potentially escalate due to climate change, we would likewise be concerned about how are people going to cooperate from the bottom up in order to respond to natural disasters and help their communities recover. Well, the detailed field work that my colleagues at the Hayek program, including Virgil Storr, Stephanie Heffley, and Laura Grube engaged in, helps us provide a framework for thinking about how communities can come together to recover from disasters. And so these are just a few of the ways we can think about climate peace. To conclude, many have argued that rapid adaptation requires warlike mobilization. However, this poses knowledge problems and power problems. Uh, a better solution, we argue, builds on polycentric self-governance from the bottom up to hopefully find ways to sustain climate peace. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Nathan, for this great presentation. So dear attendees, now is the time for the Q&A. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A function. I will begin posing them one at a time. As we give some time for the remaining attendees to put their questions there, let me start with my own question first, Nathan. So you talked about the polycentric alternative to climate change policy, which I'm very, very sympathetic to. Um, but what would you say to someone who would insist that actually we already do have a lot of
Mhm,
polycentrism at the moment in
mhm,
response to climate change policy because we don't have like the United Nations or a world government that's commanding and controlling different countries and actors and companies and what to do. So there is already some semblance of polycentricity already there, including companies, governments, NGOs at different levels already trying things out. So, given that, what exactly are some specific implications you might draw, for some of the current practice? Would you like abolish the IPCC? Would you like abolish COP? Right? What are some implications of your argument for like the current practice?
mhm. Yeah, so I'd absolutely agree that existing responses to climate change are largely occurring in a polycentric way. And that's partially because actually attempting to, given the heterogeneity of actors within nation states and within private firms and within civil society groups, it's very difficult to coordinate around a single solution. The transaction costs of doing so are prohibitive. And so the feasible solution for the time being is, I would argue, a polycentric solution. And so in some sense, this tips the war footing argument on its head. They say it's urgent, therefore we need top-down warlike mobilization. I say it's urgent, therefore we need the actors that can actually respond feasibly in the short term, that is, those engaging in a polycentric system to respond. And so I don't necessarily know if I'd want to say, abolish these bodies by which people are coordinating with one another and trying to make agreements. I think it's fine for you to have larger scale decision-making units, especially ones in which a variety of stakeholders can be contributing members to deliberations. I think the worry comes if people decide, well, this isn't going fast enough. We need to empower some narrow group with large scale discretionary and coercive power. So that's where I start to get worried. I'm not as worried specifically about some of these intergovernmental bodies, though, of course, it would be worrying if they then were used to grant ideological leeway to those who wanted to consolidate power in this way.
Great. So we start to have some questions. Let me just ask the one by James first. James Rice. He says, thanks for the discussion. Very interesting. His question, you've touched a lot on issues with top-down governance. So what are the alternatives? I think you're talking about polycentrism. Does global environmental governance preclude the possibility for polycentric and decentralized management of local ecosystems? Might it be the case that some kind of top-down supervision would serve to enable the foundations for markets, thus enabling cooperation across national and international boundaries while still stopping short of tyranny or dictatorial strong arming, which you imply would be the result of top-down planning? Here I'm thinking of decentralized networks of researchers, professionals, and political leaders who address international issues like climate change and at the same time serve to create opportunities for lower level networks to take up leadership on sustainability in turn.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, James. And so I want to emphasize that polycentricity does not preclude different scales of decision-making units. So polycentricity isn't pure decentralization. So decentralized units can, for instance, federate. They can cooperate with one another in manners that involve contracting with larger organizations. And you might have certain types of polycentric social cooperations that are, as you say, easier to sustain if those individual or smaller groups can appeal to some higher authority to adjudicate their disputes, for example, or to enforce a set of property rights that they have. And that might enable the types of grassroots social cooperation and voluntary exchange that we're interested in seeing. So yeah, I don't think it precludes all forms of global governance. It just precludes the global decision-making unit being the only or commanding center of decision making. So that decision making unit could provide a framework or a forum for people to deliberate. But the crucial thing is just that that be one decision making unit of many rather than a commander at the top of a central hierarchy.
Great. So we have another question which is pretty interesting. Um, it says, how do you think polycentricity can address climate reparations, given that this proposal that you are making is a very pro-property rights proposal? So is it sufficient to address climate reparations, which seems to be a big discussion in the
Mm-hmm.
environmental discourse today?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I will confess that I have limited knowledge of the existing literature on climate reparations. So I don't want to speak in a manner that suggests my thoughts are fully formed or to overstate my strength of views on the question. But I'm favorable towards reparations in general because we can think of many existing property titles as having been acquired unjustly through violations of the property rights of others. So, for instance, it might be the case that certain types of large-scale pollution have caused sufficiently severe harms to the property rights of those adversely affected by climate change that it can be understood that these actors have committed a tort against those who are harmed by climate change. And if that's the case, they have, feasibly violated the property rights of those who bear disproportionate harms from climate change. And it might be the case that you'd want some forum for adjudicating those claims, something akin to a court system that adjudicates other tort claims. And you might then use that as a mechanism for discovering what might be suitable reparations for those types of harms that have been done. And so I think a polycentric system can include that. The crucial thing is just that you don't have some decision maker or committee at the top that's deciding for the whole world, we're going to tally up who is the beneficiary of climate change or the main perpetrator and who is the victim. Instead, you have a bottom-up process where individuals, groups, organizations, potentially nation states, potentially civil society groups are filing claims and saying, we have been harmed by climate change in this way. And we believe that this group, this nation, this company uh, is liable for the harm they have done to us via their pollution. And so that seems like how you would get a discovery process akin to Hayek's work on the evolution of the common law that could get us some type of restitution or reparations that emerges in a manner that respects property rights and respects the rule of law.
Great. Thank you, Nathan, for that answer. So are there any remaining questions? Maybe I'll just give it a few seconds for anyone to type in some remaining questions. In the meantime, I'd like to point all of your attention to an upcoming event that I'm hosting in LSE titled Epistemic Pluralism and Climate Change, featuring Professor Mike Hume from Cambridge University. The argument is somewhat in parallel to what Dr. Goodman has presented today. I've dropped the link in the chat there. There is an online live option available for anyone around the world to join that. This will be in March, if I'm not wrong, so the 10th of March. So do check that out if you're interested. It seems there are no further questions. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight or today, wherever you're from. Thank you very much, Nathan, as well, for making this excellent presentation. I will be putting the link to Nathan's paper in the YouTube video description, and this presentation will be uploaded in the next few days. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you, Nathan, for your time.
Thank you, Brian. I've really enjoyed this.